Ultramarine players have eaten well recently. The Victrix Guard, a few characters, an upgrade sprue, and even the recently released Titus and Company. That's great if you're an Ultramarine player, but what if, like me, you're a collector of a successor? Well, it turns out that those Ultramarine releases can be put to good use by you too, and in this video, I'll be showing you precisely how. So join me as I convert Titus into a captain of the Minotaurs chapter. Naturally, I began with a new Titus kit and removed all the parts required to assemble Titus before cleaning them up. My first task in turning this heavily adorned Ultramarines captain into a captain of the Minotaurs was to remove any and all Ultramarine symbols, starting with Imperialis emblazoned across the chest. I began this process by first removing larger chunks with my knife before employing a scraping motion to remove the rest. I finished this off with some fine grit sandpaper to achieve a smooth, featureless surface. The small Ultramarine symbols at the bottom of the Tarugis were a little trickier to remove though. My approach here was to remove the horizontal parts of the symbols in order to create more of a generic rounded cap. I mainly used my knife for this, but I also grabbed a little more sandpaper to smooth it out. The remaining sculpted on Ultramarine iconography that I removed were across the belt, cape and power pack. To replace these symbols with something a little more Minotaur-y, I grabbed some Tamiya putty. Like green stuff, it's a two-part putty, but it comes in these handy separate packages to prevent them from curing in storage. After cutting and mixing up a small amount, I allowed it to cure for about 30 minutes. This just firmed things up a little more that allowed me to achieve the subsequent hard-edged shapes. The Minotaurs borrow heavily from ancient Spartan aesthetics, and along with them comes the lambda symbol. Although thought to be used by Spartan warriors, it was instead used by the auxiliary forces employed and armed by Sparta. Still, it's an interesting Greek symbol that's ideal for my Minotaur. To create the lambda, I first added a small lump of the putty to the cloak before shaping it into a rough triangle. The bottom was then cut out to create an upside down V shape to give me the basic shape. I then began to refine and sharpen out the edges until I was left with a clear, defined symbol. This process was then repeated across the belt and the power pack. There aren't too many official Minotaur miniatures, but we do have Asterion Moloch to use as a reference point. His Terminator armor features a style inspired by a lorica musculata or a muscle cuirass used by the ancient Greeks. To recreate this appearance on my own captain, I first added 2 lumps of putty to each side of the freshly cleared chest. These were flattened out into pectoral muscles with a sharper, less organic shape. With these in place, I added more putty around the midriff and sculpted these into abdominal muscles before leaving all of the putty to fully cure overnight. Once cured, I could return to all of the sculpted details and use a little more sandpaper to further smooth out and sharpen the edges of the armor and lambda symbols that I'd added. Now, before we continue with our Minotaur captain, let me first take a moment to discuss the sponsors of today's video. Tabletop Stronghold. They are the creators of this, the Mag Case 2.0, and as the name suggests, it's a magnetic carrying case and the solution to your army storage problems. We've all been through the tissue paper in a takeaway tub phase, maybe even tried some cut-out foam trays, and just possibly thrown our models loose and completely unprotected into a box. But those days of chipped paint and broken spears are a thing of the past, as the Mag Case employs these steel trays that make up the interior of the case. They can be easily moved around to create different heights between the shelves, meaning you can just as easily store your oversized units as you can your infantry models. The models are held securely in place by gluing the provided magnets to their bases, and because they pull all the way out, they're also really helpful when you're deploying, packing up, or moving between tables at a tournament. The clear Perspex panel at the front also means that when not carrying your army to the next game, the Mag Case also doubles up as a display case. The rest of the case is constructed from laser-cut MDF and comes disassembled, but it is incredibly simple to build. Just a few screws, bolts, and a couple of hinges, and you'll have a strong enough case to hold the weight of a 250-pound wizard. So, if you're looking for a sturdy, secure, and sleek-looking case to keep your miniatures safe, both on the go and at home, then check out the Mag Case 2.0 from Tabletop Stronghold. They're a small business based in West Virginia, but they offer free shipping to the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and most of the EU. So wherever you are, you can take advantage of my code PEAT25 to get a huge 25% off your order. So check them out for yourself by using my link in the comments and description. A big thank you to Tabletop Stronghold. Now let's get back to that Minotaur captain. With the armor and symbols complete, my next area of change was to swap out Titus's chainsword with the spear. Again, I was inspired by Moloch here, and in order to mount a spear to the torso, I needed a forearm and a hand in a different orientation. Specifically, this hammer hand that came from the Assault Intercessor kit. After clipping away the forearm from the hammer arm and Titus's forearm, I trimmed and adjusted both until I was able to match them up. For the spear itself, I took the spear from the Horus Heresy melee weapons upgrade set. This is normally held by two arms, so to create that one-handed upright look, I needed to make a few more trims. I clipped away the hammerhead along with the spearhead, using their bands as cutting points. For the lower hand, I clipped away as much as I could before using the tip of my scalpel to carefully scour in the wrapped leather pattern seen adjacent to it. Once all the required cuts and trims had been made, I then assembled the spear, but didn't put the arm to the torso just yet. Before I assembled the model though, I first had to remove the inscribed Ultramar and Macragge on the scenic base. The simplest way to achieve this was to just use a little more putty, but this time some grey putty from AK Interactive. This is a water-based putty, which means that after applying some across the text, I could wipe away the excess with a damp finger. Then, after allowing it to dry, I was able to sand smooth the excess so that just the indentations were filled. From here, I was able to assemble the torso and temporarily mount the model to its scenic base. This gave me a good indication about where the pommel of the spear would sit. It sat a little higher above the rocks, so I decided to grab a Terminator helmet from the Battlefield Trophies kit and glue it to the base, providing a rest point to the spear. Which brought me to the final detail, the head. Naturally, I didn't want to use the original Titus head. I was tempted to grab another Ultramarine head, but I instead decided on the slightly more grizzled look of the Space Wolf Grey Hunter head. As the teeth weren't exposed, that wasn't really anything that identified this head as clearly being a Space Wolf. But instead of attaching it to the torso, I decided to keep it separate to make painting a little easier. To help me hold onto the head and power pack while I painted, I drilled a 1mm diameter hole into both the head and power pack and superglued a length of wire into them. The captain himself was then mounted to a temporary, smaller base. This left me with 4 separate pieces that I coated with a black primer, leaving me ready to get started with the painting. As this was quite a complex and heavily detailed miniature, I decided to apply all of my base coats first. This would mean that, should I overspill onto other areas, I could easily go back and reapply the original base coat to clean it up. My first base coat was Spartan Bronze from the Tooth and Coats range, and this was applied across the armour to create that Minotaur armour scheme. As with all of my base coats, I mixed in a little water to my paint and applied a couple of thin layers to achieve a smooth base colour. For the remaining decorative details, I used some of the muted Ancient Gold. This was applied across the various trinkets, stock of the bolter, and banding around the spear. The remaining metallics, i.e. the steel details, were then given a coat of Surcoat Silver. After completing the metallic base coats, I swapped out my paint water to prevent cross-contamination of the metallic flakes and grabbed some Amphora Red. This was used to paint the cloak, wrappings around the spear, and the tarugis. For the fur across the shoulders, I used some Scorched Earth. And for the skin, I applied a base coat of Barbarian Brawn. Next, I turned my attention to the rocks across the base, and to create that concrete look, I gave them a coat of Dungeon Stone Grey. Continuing with the greys, I next used Wizard Grey over the details that I would ultimately wish to be white. This includes the various lambda symbols and braided cord across the chest. The final base coat was just to clean up any overspills that I may have made across the hair and gaps between the armour. For all of these, I used some Doom Death Black. With all my base coats complete, I could begin applying some washes. The first of these was created by mixing some Cygor Brown with a little airbrush thinner. Contrast paints are very strongly pigmented, and the thinner just lowered the intensity of the paint and reduced its viscosity. With the wash mixed, I applied this across the armour, fur, gold details, and rocks, where it flowed into the recesses to create a brown tinge shading. For the shading on the cloak, I decided to create a mixture of the Cygor Brown with some Flesh Tearers Red. This resulted in a deep, dark red that I added some glaze medium to. Unlike the thinner, used in the previous step, this medium maintained the same viscosity but still reduced the strength of the pigment. This allowed me to paint it into the deeper recesses and folds of the cloak. Each of these layers subtly darkened down the area, and I built up the strength of the shading over several layers. The result of this imitated the appearance of shadows forming in those recesses. In addition to the cloak, tarugi's and spear, I also used this to shade the captain's skin. From here, I created another airbrush thinner and contrast paint mixture using some Black Legion, which I applied across the steel areas of the model. And finally, I used some thin Gryph-Charger Grey across the decorative details that I painted with Wizard Grey. With my washes complete, I could now begin work on the highlights. For each of these, I generally approach them in 2 steps. The first involved me lining all of the edges with a line of paint that is brighter than the base coat. Combined with the shading, this process really helps to lift out those details and prevent your minis from looking flat. For the first of these highlights, I used some Dragon's Gold, and this was applied across the armour. The second stage of highlighting is often referred to as an extreme highlight. This is approached in a similar manner to the first, but uses an even brighter or lighter paint and is only applied to the sharpest details. I usually reserve this for things like fine points or corners, and this just adds a degree of sharpness to the details. For the armour, I used some Glistening Gold. From here, I repeated the same process across other areas. For the golden decorations, I started out with Heirloom Gold, followed by an extreme highlight created from a mixture of Heirloom Gold and Mythril Blade. To highlight the steel areas, I started out with a highlight of Plate Armour, and extreme highlighted with more Mythril Blade. Next, I began highlighting the red areas. I started this with Amphora Red, followed by Centurion Red, before applying a glazed medium thinned Flesh Tearers Red over the cloak and other red details. This layer not only helped to unify some of the previous highlights and shading, but also boosted the intensity of that red. From here, I returned to the highlights and gave the fur cloak an initial highlight of Ancient Forest, which I continued with a few small spots of Wasteland Brown to each of the fur tufts. To highlight the Minotaur Captain's skin, I began with Dwarven Skin, and followed with Elven Skin. For the rocks across the base, I used Wizard Grey, before using Carcharadon Grey as an extreme highlight across the rocks and as an initial highlight over the white decorative details, which I finished off with a few small spots of White Star. My final areas to highlight were the areas I base coated black, and for my first highlight I used Death Reaper, and finally Dungeon Stone Grey. With the model itself painted, I then filled in some of the gaps around the outside of the base with some texture paste, specifically this Dark Earth from AK Interactive. It was mainly painted between the base's edge and the sculpted on rocks, but a small amount was also added to the flat slabs. After the paste had dried, I darkened down the deeper parts of the texture with some Battle Mud wash, before bringing out the raised details with the dry brush of Dust Bowl. And with that, all I was had to do was to clean up the base rim with a marker, assemble the model, and give everything a coat of varnish, which left me with this. So, that was how I converted a Captain of the Minotaurs chapter by using the Captain Titus miniature. Now, in terms of design cues, the Ultramarines and Minotaurs are fairly similar. The Ultramarines have this Greco-Roman style that fits nicely into the Spartan aesthetic of the Minotaurs. So, with just a few small adjustments to the weapons and symbols, you can easily repurpose any of your Ultramarines as members of the Minotaurs. Now, if you enjoyed this Space Marine kit bash, be sure to leave me a like and subscribe for similar builds like this. I'd also love to hear what other chapters you'd like to see me tackle in future videos, so leave me those suggestions down in the comments. You can find all the paints and kits that I've used in this video down in the description, along with some affiliate links. I've also recently partnered with taschengelddieb.de, so if you're in Germany or any other EU country and you're looking for some discounted Warhammer, be sure to follow my links and use the code PETESQUAD for an extra 4% off at checkout. You can also pick up my Dead Animal Bits and Sorcerer Spoils kits over on my web store, sparepartsemporium.com. Anything you buy from there is packaged up and shipped by me, and all the sales go directly supporting both me and the channel. And before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Andrew Marston, Ban Yevrian, Berserker, Dakota Kaburi, Daniel Dowling, George Kinzini Roberts, Little Templar, Maciej Savitsky, Sam Sepavida, Son of Sevatar, Swedsman, Tim, and Zeth27. And my top channel members, who are Alex Verne, Andrew Chow, Bon Johnson, Chris Toomey, Dante, Dave, Doug H, Ferdinand Richardson, Guy Bazant, Jan Gazik, John Gibbs, Kaiser Waffle 11, Lariat11, Lewis Cleveland, Mark Taylor, Misa Pogon, Nerdington Paint, Patrick K, Philip Poya, Ryan O'Shaughnessy, SO, SJ Carver, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.